In the midst of a lavish party, I quietly held onto my wine glass. The grand ballroom was alive with music and laughter, but I felt completely alone. I had chosen this dress so carefully, knowing it was the style Edward had always admired, back when he still noticed such things. Those past few months had created such an emotional gulf between us, and I'd pinned all my hopes on this evening being our chance to bridge that distance. I kept telling myself that this party could be our fresh start, like those new beginnings we'd read about in marriage renewal books. But from the my mother end we arrived, Edward barely glanced my way, as if I were just another piece of the elaborate decor. He was too busy playing the social butterfly, moving from group to group with that affected air of importance he'd developed over the years. I watched him work the room like a politician at a fundraiser, captivating everyone with that charm I once fell in love with. My heart did a foolish little leap when he finally approached me, glass in hand, but I should have known better. In that condescending tone that had become all too familiar, like a teacher addressing a slow student, he remarked how miraculous it was that I'd managed to come without making a fuss. I stood there in silence, trying to swallow the humiliation along with my wine. But Edward wasn't finished. Oh no. He had to take center stage, literally climbing onto that makeshift platform and grabbing the microphone. He called out to his friends with exaggerated politeness and raised his glass with theatrical elegance. The crowd applauded, expecting one of those lovely toasts about marriage and companionship that you hear at anniversary parties. From my corner of the room, I found myself foolishly hoping he might say something kind about our life together like he used to in the early days. I was waiting for some small acknowledgement, any gesture that might suggest the man I married was still in there somewhere. But Edward had other plans, and when that mocking smile spread across his face, I felt my stomach twist into knots. With cruel precision, he told his friends that marriage was not easy, his voice dripping with irony. Then came the final blow. He announced to everyone that it was especially difficult when one forgot that their wife was an interesting person, and I felt the uncomfortable laughter from the crowd sting my skin. I felt my stomach shrink as he continued his cruel performance. With malicious eyes, he added his thoughts about how I could still wear this dress like I was 20, even after having 3 children. His words pierced through me, and as the laughter around us grew louder, I felt the air being sucked out of my lungs. He savored the my mother end as he declared that no sane man would want a woman who was withering away, himself included. I felt my entire body freeze, wanting desperately to disappear but finding my feet nailed to the floor. I wanted to scream, but no words came out. Only the sound of laughter, whispers, and pitying glances reached me. My husband Edward had shattered me into pieces in public. Without a word, I placed my glass on a nearby table and turned on my heel to leave the ballroom. I couldn't stay there another second. Each step toward the exit was a desperate attempt to keep myself from falling apart. The first tears fell as I passed through the door, but I didn't stop. I knew exactly where I needed to go. My footsteps echoed on the empty sidewalk as I made my way to my mother's house, the world seemingly indifferent to the storm raging inside me. When I crossed the threshold, my mother, Anne, welcomed me with worried eyes and open arms, asking no questions. I collapsed into her embrace, letting go of an unbearable weight. That night, there were no words. Just quiet tears falling as she rested her head on top of mine. Sitting at her kitchen table, holding a warm cup of tea, I finally allowed myself to be completely enveloped by grief. I felt like I'd lost more than just my husband. I'd lost my dignity, my dreams, and my self-respect. The next morning, I woke to sunlight filtering through old curtains and a heavy pressure in my chest. I knew I had to move forward, but I had no idea how to begin. My mother moved quietly in the kitchen, making coffee, and waiting for me to find my words. Finally, with a trembling voice, I told her I never imagined Edward would humiliate me like this. She set the coffee maker on the stove and sat across from me, looking at me with gentle but unpitying eyes. Her words hit me like a splash of reality when she said I'd spent too long living to please that man, and it was time to think about myself. For years, I had shaped my life around Edward, trying to be the woman he wanted. And what had it gotten me? I was alone, broken, and abandoned in the middle of a life that no longer felt like my own. Over the next few days, I avoided social media, but I'd become the talk of the internet after Edward's cousin posted about the party incident. When I came to get my things from the house, Edward had his lawyer present and greeted me with a malicious smile. He told me he could be generous if I agreed to the divorce. I shook my head absently and climbed the stairs to my room. There, I found most of the things left behind in cardboard boxes, packed by someone I didn't know. They seemed like someone else's belongings. I placed my wedding ring carelessly on the desk and left without a word, catching just a glimpse of surprise in Edward's eyes. Then I walked out with my head held high, facing the pitying, regretful, and uncomfortable stares as I reclaimed myself step by step. I started a new job, began attending evening yoga classes, and for the first time in my life, listened to my own voice while taking walks. Sometimes I cried, sometimes I shook with anger, and finally, I found my smile again. One morning, looking in the mirror, I found the woman I'd forgotten for years, strong and free. It wasn't a sudden change, but it was my mother and I reclaimed myself. Yes, I was reborn. One afternoon, unable to contain my curiosity, I checked Edward's profile. It was like reopening an unhealed wound. Among the photos and comments, I found recent pictures of him with a young woman. A young dancer with coquettish eyes and a slim figure. No more evidence was needed. Edward had betrayed me. Something began to burn inside me, a flame of anger that had lain dormant for years. As I closed my phone, I made a firm decision that I would no longer cry for someone who never treasured me. That night, I stared at myself in the bathroom mirror. My swollen eyes and pale face showed my exhaustion, but beyond that broken reflection, I could see a spark of determination beginning to light. I decided it was time to reclaim what I had lost. My strength, my identity, and my self-worth. The days at my mother's house passed slowly, but each one was a small step forward. I began to find a sense of control in daily tasks that I had lost during my marriage. Cleaning the house and preparing meals, and Mom's gentle voice became the foundation of my new routine. The wounds were still open, but I no longer felt defeated. One afternoon, while cleaning the windows of my mother's small sewing workshop in the backyard, I decided it was time to start something new. I took out an old notebook and wrote down ideas for a small business. I needed something productive to occupy my mind, something to help me reclaim the sense of purpose I had lost under Edward's shadow. That evening, after a simple dinner with Mom, I pulled out a box from the closet that I had avoided opening for a long time. As I gently touched the fabric of my old sewing machine, I remembered when I used to dream of creating my own fashion line. I made a firm decision that if I was going to start anew, this would be my beginning. In the days that followed, I dedicated myself to recovering my sewing skills. At first, my hands were clumsy, but the muscle memory soon returned, along with the joy of creating something from nothing. Each stitch became a small step in my emotional recovery, a thread stitching together my shattered self-esteem. One afternoon, while making final adjustments to a dress, I heard footsteps approaching in the hallway. Looking up, I saw Justin, a young man I had met by chance at a cafe a few days earlier. His presence was surprising but not unwelcome. Rather, it felt like a sign that fate had sent at just the right moment. He stood in the doorway with a friendly smile, hoping he wasn't interrupting. My response came out softer than expected as I smiled back, assuring him he wasn't interrupting at all. Justin stepped forward, observing the fabrics and patterns on the table with genuine interest. When he asked if I was a designer, his voice carried pure curiosity. I told him I used to dream of it, but things hadn't worked out as planned. He picked up a piece of fabric, examining it with a mixture of gentleness and admiration, telling me it was never too late to start again. I felt an unexpected warmth in my chest. There was something in Justin's gaze that saw me as someone capable and worthy of respect, not as the vulnerable woman Edward had scorned. That chance encounter became the beginning of something deeper. Justin started dropping by regularly, bringing coffee or just sitting and talking while I worked. Gradually, I began to trust his presence. At first, I found it hard to believe that someone so young and attractive could be genuinely interested in someone like me, but eventually, I stopped questioning and learned to enjoy the present. Justin never demanded anything or imposed expectations. He was simply there, patient and unforgiving, accompanying me through my healing process. One night, I stayed in the kitchen, reflecting on how much had changed in such a short period. I was no longer the woman who had fled the ballroom with a shattered heart. The scars were still there, but they were beginning to transform into lessons. Justin appeared at the door with the smile that always gave me hope. He approached without words and took my hand. No grand promises, no words, just a sincere gesture. At that moment, I understood that it might be possible to find love even after such pain. As the days passed, I felt the weight of my story with Edward fade away with the morning sun. Painful memories still surfaced during quiet nights and nostalgic moments, but they no longer held their former power. They were just shadows of the past that couldn't stop my progress. Now, when I recalled those moments of humiliation and contempt, a new certainty rose strongly within me. I hadn't just survived, I was flourishing. The small sewing workshop I'd started out of financial necessity soon transformed into something deeper. Each stitch became a step forward, a way of weaving a new life. As neighbors began recommending me to their acquaintances, orders quickly increased. I was no longer just doing repairs and hemming. I was creating unique clothes with special meaning. Each piece was a quiet declaration that I was reclaiming myself. The workshop that had once been forgotten and dust-covered became the beating heart of my new reality. Though the work rhythm was demanding, it didn't tire me like before. I felt a small victory with each completed piece. With every thread I joined, it felt as if my soul was being mended too. As weeks passed, I began to recognize myself again in the mirror. As a strong, capable woman full of possibility. Justin remained a pillar throughout this rebuilding process, not just emotional support, but a companion who shared daily burdens without expecting anything in return. His presence was constant but never suffocating. He helped with everything from cleaning the workshop to preparing dinner when I was finishing urgent orders. Though unspoken, Justin knew his patience and love were becoming fertile soil for my reblooming. One evening, as we cooked together, a special quietness filled the air. The sound of boiling pots and the aroma of fresh bread created a cozy atmosphere. Justin watched me intently, pausing to observe something different in my movements. The confidence he'd been hoping to see since we met. While drying his hands with a towel, he asked with his characteristic calmness if I realized how far I'd come. I looked at him in surprise, as if I'd never considered the possibility. I'd been so focused on moving forward that I hadn't taken time to reflect on my achievements. With a shy smile, I admitted I hadn't thought about it. Justin approached slowly and took my hand with the gentleness of someone who knows true love doesn't need to hurry. His voice became a whisper as he told me I should look back, that I'd left behind the person who never gave herself proper credit. Those words resonated deeply in my soul. For the first time, someone recognized not just my efforts, but my true worth. Meanwhile, Edward remained trapped in a world of false promises. What had started as a perfect fantasy with the young dancer, secret getaways, passionate nights, and a life without complications, soon faded like all superficial things. The dancer who had initially admired him began showing her true nature, demanding, capricious, always expecting more than Edward could give. To protect his pride, Edward convinced himself that he had made the right decision and tried to cling to the relationship. But with each show of her indifference, something inside him began to waver. The promise of happiness he thought he'd found was turning to sand in his hands. On lonely nights, he would check his phone, expecting messages from me. He was convinced that the emotional dependency he'd cultivated over the years would bring me back. But all he got was complete silence. A deafening silence that slowly crumbled his arrogance. Doubt and anxiety began to grow in his mind. Had he underestimated me? Had he lost more than he cared to admit by losing me? It was a possibility I hadn't even allowed myself to consider until now. Yet every time I thought of Edward now, I felt the weight of an uncomfortable truth. Perhaps I wasn't just fine without him, but better off. Meanwhile, I continued weaving the threads of my new life. With each dress I sewed, each laugh I shared with Justin, and each quiet moment, the emotional distance from Edward grew wider. I no longer needed his approval or forgiveness. I'd learned to forgive myself and become the author of my own destiny. Justin, always by my side, never rushed me to define our relationship's future, understanding I still needed time to heal completely. That's why I felt safe with him. There was no hurry, no pressure, just the freedom to choose my own path. One afternoon, while organizing my small workshop for new orders, I felt a deep peace I hadn't experienced in a long time. For the first time, I stopped thinking about what I'd lost and began focusing on what I was building. Edward's shadow still appeared in my mind, but like an echo from a past that could no longer reach me, it had grown distant. The future was full of possibilities. Though I wasn't sure where my path would lead, I knew with absolute certainty that I would never again let someone else determine my worth. Each step I took with Justin reaffirmed that self-respect was the greatest victory. Edward, unaware of this process, remained trapped in his illusion of control. But I was no longer the same person, and the power he once had over me had vanished. Time flowed like a quiet river, and with it, my relationship with Justin grew stronger in a current of mutual trust and affection. Our days together confirmed I would never return to my old life. I was no longer afraid to feel vulnerable. I knew Justin was different. He was someone who didn't demand, compare, or judge. Every gesture, every look from him reminded me that love could be light and genuine. One sunny afternoon, after a long walk in the park, we arrived at the small cafe where we'd begun nurturing our intimacy. The golden sunset light illuminated the outdoor tables, creating a cozy atmosphere. While ordering coffee, Justin took my hand, and time seemed to stop. There was something in his expression, a mix of excitement and nervousness that piqued my curiosity. He began speaking with his usual gentle seriousness that always reassured me, saying he'd been thinking about something important. As if confirming his sincerity, he gently squeezed my hand, asking if we could give ourselves a real chance, just him and me. I felt my heart rate quicken. After so long believing I could never trust again, Justin's words seemed unreal. Yet there they were, clear, direct, offering a different future. But the shadows of the past still weighed heavily on my heart. I told him that while I wanted to be with him, truly, there were things I needed to resolve first. Justin showed no irritation or impatience, just that calm smile that could always ease my anxiety. He replied in a steady voice that I didn't need to explain anything now. He just wanted me to know he'd be there no matter what. That gesture of patience became my final confirmation. For the first time in a long while, I felt I could trust someone completely. I knew Justin was someone I wanted to build a new story with. That night, alone in my room, I made a bold decision. I knew Edward would return someday. His relationship with the dancer who had enchanted him was destined to fail, and in his arrogance, he would try to win me back. But this time, I wouldn't be a victim. The next day, I decided to share my plan with my mother. Though she couldn't fully understand my determination, she listened quietly. When she asked, worry seeping into her voice. If I was sure this was the right thing, I nodded with a calmness she had never seen in me before. It was the calmness of someone who had finally reclaimed control of their life. I looked at my mother and said with quiet determination, "Trust me, Mom, this time it's different." I could see she wanted to say something, but the words caught in her throat as she noticed a resolve in my eyes she'd never seen before. Like many mothers who lived through difficult marriages in their own time, she was worried about what would happen, yet I could tell she was proud of my courage. I left nothing to chance, carefully selecting the venue for our final confrontation. I chose a place similar to the banquet where Edward had once humiliated me in public, the kind of setting where he would try to manipulate me again, expecting everything to go his way like it always had. Edward couldn't possibly imagine that this time I was one step ahead of him. The days leading up to the banquet were a whirlwind of emotions. My resolve was firm, but the scars of the past lingered. There were nights when I woke up in the middle of the night, haunted by Edward's cruel words. But whenever doubt crept in like an unwelcome guest, I thought about Justin and the opportunity he represented. A chance at the kind of partnership I'd watched my friends enjoy in their second acts of life. That vision of the future gave me the strength I needed to move forward. Justin didn't fully understand my desire for a public confrontation with Edward. He was always by my side. He never once questioned my decisions, understanding that I needed to close this chapter on my own terms. Justin would reassure me with his unwavering patience, telling me he'd be in my corner no matter what happened, words I'd come to treasure, reminding me of the kind of man I wished I'd married the first time around. The night of the banquet, I wore an elegant dress I'd had made myself, a silent declaration of everything I'd achieved since leaving Edward. As I looked in the mirror, I felt a confidence I had never experienced before. I wasn't that frightened woman anymore, the one who'd let her husband diminish her. I had become the author of my own destiny. When I arrived at the venue, I could feel all eyes on me, like spotlights on a stage I'd finally chosen to stand on. As expected, Edward quickly approached, wearing that familiar false smile, acting as if he could draw me back. With artificial sweetness, he expressed his pleasure at my attendance, reaching for my hand as if nothing had ever happened between us. I smiled back, not the smile of a woman in love, but of someone about to win a long-awaited victory. "Thank you, Edward." "I'm happy to see you too," I replied, my voice laced with sweet poison. As the evening progressed, Edward couldn't resist his performance, making snide remarks disguised as innocent comments to the guests. He announced to everyone, with that practiced laugh of his, that I had always had a flair for the dramatic, his eyes scanning the room to ensure he had an audience. That was my cue. I took the microphone from the host with overwhelming composure. "Dear friends, thank you for being here with us today," I began, looking straight at Edward. "I have something important to share with you all." The room fell silent instantly. All eyes were fixed on me. "Edward and I have formally ended our relationship," I announced with a serene smile. "And I'd like to tell you why." Edward was unfaithful during our marriage with a dancer. Everything in the room came to a standstill. Edward tried to interrupt, but I stopped him with a gesture as firm as my newfound confidence. "Today marks the beginning of my new life," I continued. "A life where I choose happiness and freedom." Then, as if on cue, I turned toward Justin, who had been watching from across the room. He approached without hesitation and extended a warm, steady hand. I sealed my declaration with a kiss in front of everyone, making my choice crystal clear. Without looking back, I left the banquet hall with Justin, knowing my relationship with Edward was over for good. I left Edward behind in the darkness of his own arrogance. The days after the banquet were a mix of relief and meaningful silence. I had revealed the truth, walked away from a toxic marriage, and begun writing a new chapter. But there were still loose ends to tie up. There was the pending conversation with my mother, final arrangements with Edward, and the move to a new city with Justin, the final symbol of my liberation. The first crucial conversation was with my mother, who had been confused and worried since the banquet. She couldn't understand why I had agreed to see Edward again after everything he'd done. She repeatedly asked me about my motivations, her anxiety as visible as worry lines on her face. Finally, I decided to reveal everything to her. With a warm cup of tea in my hands, I sat in the living room and gazed at my mother with a serene expression, ready to explain everything. "Mom, it wasn't about reconciliation," I said firmly. I explained that it had been a plan. I knew Edward would try to humiliate me publicly again, as he always did, and I just needed to give him his favorite stage to expose his true nature to everyone. My mother fell into a surprised silence, and despite her initial concerns, I could tell she couldn't help but feel proud of my courage. She gently asked me about my future plans. I took a deep breath. I told her I was leaving now, that Justin and I had chosen an apartment in another city, and that I wanted to start fresh, away from all of this. My mother looked at me with tears in her eyes. Tears of farewell, but also tears of pride. I knew she recognized that I had finally chosen the right path to happiness. Meanwhile, Edward was refusing to accept reality. Since the night of the banquet, he had been trying to regain control. He would send me messages, try to meet, and sometimes appear at my house unannounced, desperately trying to get me back. But each attempt hit an unbreakable wall. I was no longer the woman he had manipulated for years. Finally, Edward decided to make one last appearance, just as I was packing the final boxes for my move. This time, I didn't avoid the confrontation. Determined to completely close this chapter of my life, I let him into the apartment. Edward looked around the living room with an odd sensation, as if the space we once shared was no longer his. And indeed, it wasn't. Looking at me continue packing with irritation, he expressed his confusion about my actions. He insisted we could still fix things. I gazed at him with a merciless calm. No anger or resentment remained in my eyes, only peaceful certainty. I told him there was nothing to fix, that our relationship no longer existed. He took a desperate step toward me, asking if I was really leaving with that man, with Justin. Without blinking, I looked at him with unwavering determination. I confirmed that yes, I was going with Justin, and told Edward he was lucky. If he had done anything worse, we wouldn't be having this conversation, he would be in prison. Edward stepped back, struck by the conviction in my words. It was a painful reflection of what he had lost and could never regain. He whispered, unable to understand how it had come to this, asking why we couldn't try again. I placed the last box by the door and gave him a final look. The answer was simple, though he would never understand it. I wasn't the same person anymore, and I didn't want to be. The following days passed quickly. The apartment became empty, except for the memories I chose to leave behind. The move was easy. There were few material things that really mattered, and the most valuable thing we were taking with us was our hard-won freedom. Justin arrived early with his car to help with the last boxes. There was something special about that moment, a sense of leaving sorrow behind and moving toward a future full of possibilities. I smiled watching him help without asking anything in return, with that calming presence that had become my comfort. Before getting in the car, I paused for a few seconds at the building entrance and took a deep breath. It was a complete goodbye, not just to a place, but to the life I had once shared with Edward. I knew he wouldn't come to say goodbye. He was now in an empty house, trapped in the prison of his own making, facing his loneliness. Justin approached and put his arm around my shoulders. He asked with a gentle smile if I was ready. With a great sense of peace inside, I told him I was more ready than I'd ever been. We got into the car and started our journey toward a new life, without looking back. While I was blossoming into a new phase, Edward was sinking deeper into darkness. Looking at Edward's house now, I can see how what was once his symbol of control has become his silent prison, each day passing in emptiness and regret. He tried to find solace in his work, but even his time in the office no longer brought him comfort. The shadows became his only constant companion, following him through the hollow rooms of what used to be his kingdom. He reached out to old friends for help, but they had grown weary of his long-standing arrogance and manipulation, and kept their distance. Even the dancer, the woman he betrayed me for, had walked away, realizing there was no future with a man who couldn't love anyone but himself. He was left in complete solitude, surrounded by meaningless material possessions, akin to yesterday's newspaper. Every corner of his house reminded him of me, my laughter echoing through empty halls, our conversations over morning coffee, the subtle warmth of my presence that he'd taken for granted. His regret became an open wound that wouldn't stop bleeding, like a paper cut that goes deeper than it should. Meanwhile, Justin and I were building a new life filled with small, meaningful moments. We'd settled in a new town and opened a sewing workshop together, a dream Edward had never understood or supported. Every garment I crafted became a symbol of my rebirth, a testament to reclaiming and reshaping my life. Our afternoons were filled with walks in the open air, shared laughter that came from the heart, and projects we worked on side by side, like dancing partners in perfect rhythm. For the first time in many years, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. There were no ghosts from the past chasing me anymore, just the present moment I had chosen for myself. One afternoon, while walking in the park, Justin took my hand and looked at me with a smile that reached his eyes. He asked if I realized how far we'd come, his voice soft with wonder. I looked back at him with gratitude, feeling that each precious day was becoming a source of pride. Yes, I said, and the best part is, this is just the beginning. I had found more than new love. I had discovered the freedom to become the person I'd always wanted to be, like a butterfly finally breaking free from its chrysalis. And so, with a light heart and eyes fixed on tomorrow, I closed the final chapter of my old life and began writing a completely new story. The sun cast soft light on our new furniture and the simple items Justin and I had chosen together, each piece selected with purpose and care. Every item in our home now reflected the peace and freedom that filled our lives. There weren't any luxuries, but genuine warmth radiated from every corner. The kind that only grows in a home built from love, not pretense. There was no more anxiety, no painful memories weighing me down like heavy chains. I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. Each day was a personal victory, another step further from the pain I'd left behind. One night, as I was resting on the balcony, I silently gazed at the horizon. The twinkling city lights seemed like promises of new possibilities stretching out before me. Justin noticed my expression and looked at me tenderly. "Are you okay?" he asked, already knowing the answer. I nodded, resting my head on his shoulder. "I'm better than okay," I said with a peaceful smile. "I finally feel like I'm exactly where I'm meant to be." As days passed, the shadows of my old marriage grew fainter until they finally disappeared completely. I no longer needed Edward's forgiveness, nor did I seek his redemption. What mattered was the life I had chosen. This unfettered, hope-filled life I was building with Justin. And so, with a light heart and eyes fixed on tomorrow, I closed the final chapter of my past story and began a new one without fear or limitations. Thank you for watching our stories. Please subscribe to our channel to receive more touching stories. Turn on the notification bell to be the first to know about new updates. We look forward to your comments.